Hi there, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for joining us today for our panel, A Year-End Review, Recapping Global AI Governance Efforts. My name is Owen Daniels. I'm Associate Director of Analysis and Andrew W. Marshall Fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology. So I'm going to introduce our expert panelists in a moment, but first I'd like to provide some strategic scene setting for our conversation on global AI governance. In 2023, AI truly grabbed the world's attention with the explosion of an impressive array of large language models from leading AI firms. These models' abilities to interact with people and to engage with users in a seemingly human way, not to mention their myriad other possibilities, captured the public imagination. They also conjured a host of potential opportunities and risks for society and policymakers to consider across different use cases that many had not imagined before. The reality, though, as many of you know, is that AI's opportunities and challenges are not all new or unforeseen and are not limited to foundational AI models, making broad AI governance efforts an important policy priority. To keep pace with AI development, policymakers around the globe have begun to explore how they can effectively govern AI systems. In the US, the Biden administration issued its October 2023 executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of AI, which was intended to shift the bureaucracy into action and kickstart new safety initiatives. Congress and federal agencies hosted hearings and developed new frameworks and standards to support safe and secure AI development. States also began to consider their roles in AI governance, evidenced in proposed legislation like California's State Bill 1047. But AI governance concerns obviously extend beyond the US, as allies, partners, and competitors consider how to govern AI systems and applications. The European Union continued its work on its AI Act throughout 2023, and the Act entered into force in August of this year, providing a legal regulatory framework for AI. The Act landed amid the context of European self-reflection around economic and technological competitiveness, challenges captured in the recent Draghi report. Meanwhile, China announced its Global AI Governance Initiative, a framework for developing and governing AI, for which it is aiming to attract international support from a broad range of actors. Our panelists today will cover how these efforts began, how they progressed to the present, and how they may evolve amidst a shifting geopolitical context. Their analysis is based on CSET's growing body of work on AI governance, which is intended to help policymakers consider guardrails for development that can promote safe, rapid technology adoption. Today, we'll highlight some findings from a number of CSET reports and publications, and we'll share some links, which you can also find on our website. Governance is an admittedly squidgy term, which allows for a lot of variety in global approaches, which our panel today will cover in great detail. So without further ado, let's get started, and I'll introduce our speakers. They'll provide a few minutes of remarks on the regional focus areas that I mentioned, followed by a moderated Q&A, and then we'll turn the door open to you for some questions. So proceeding in order here, first we have Mina Narayanan. Mina is a research analyst at Georgetown University's CSET, focusing on AI governance and safe and trustworthy AI. Before joining us here, she worked at the State Department in the Bureau of Consular Affairs, where she monitored developments and prepared correspondence for international child abduction cases. Previously, she leveraged topic modeling to analyze research portfolios at the National Institute of Nursing Research as a Coding It Forward Fellow. Mina holds a Bachelor of Software Engineering with a minor in Political Science from Auburn University and a Master of Science in Public Policy and Management from Carnegie Mellon. Next, we have Mia Hoffmann. Mia is a research fellow for AI governance at CSET. In her work, she explores international approaches to AI regulation and investigates AI harm incidents, gaining a deeper understanding of failure modes and the efficacy of AI risk mitigation practices. Prior to joining CSET, Mia worked at the European Commission and as a researcher in Brussels, where she studied AI adoption in the economy and its implications for jobs and workers. Mia holds a master's in economics from Lund University in Sweden and a bachelor's in international economics from the University of Tübingen in Germany. And finally, last but not least, we have Cole McFaul. Cole is a research analyst at CSET, where he mainly focuses on emerging technology issues in the Asia Pacific and China's science and technology ecosystem. Before joining CSET, Cole researched China's political economy and international engagement strategies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford. Cole holds a BA in political science and an MA in East Asian studies from Stanford. So each of our panelists will focus on some of the areas that I discussed in the intro comments. We'll take about 10 to 12 minutes of initial remarks, have some moderated Q&A, and then open up the floor to all of you. So without further ado, Mina, why don't you take it away?
Sure. Thanks so much, Owen. This past year has been really busy for US AI governance. The past year has made clear that the United States views AI innovation and adoption as critical to maintaining its leadership on the world stage. The US has also reaffirmed AI safety and trustworthiness as a key driver for AI innovation and adoption. So thinking back a year ago, President Biden signed the executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy AI development and use. This was an expansive order covering topics ranging from privacy and algorithmic discrimination to labor market impacts of AI. And because the order is so vast, I'll just touch on a few significant outcomes from it. First, the Secretary of Commerce created the US AI Safety Institute and Consortium to fulfill lots of NIST duties outlined in the executive order. The Secretary of Commerce also directed NIST to create some guidance that complemented NIST's AI risk management framework. Used Defense Production Act authorities to compel developers of dual-use foundation models to report information about those models, and also published a proposed rule requiring cloud service providers to report information on foreign actors training large AI models. The National Science Foundation earlier this year, along with several other agencies, launched the National AI Research Resource, which is essentially shared compute and data infrastructure for research and academic communities. The Office of Management and Budget also released several important memos this year. The first focused on advancing AI governance, risk management in the US government, and it outlined several minimum risk management practices for safety and rights impacting AI. And the second memo focused on a responsible acquisition of AI in the US government and encourage agencies to promote a competitive AI marketplace. Just a few days ago, President Biden issued the National Security Memorandum on AI, which seeks to harness AI for national security purposes. It focuses on a few different areas, including strengthening the domestic AI ecosystem, advancing AI safety and security, adopting AI in the national security context, and also advancing international AI governance. And so a few significant takeaways from that memo are doubling down on the National AI Research Resource, designating the AI Safety Institute as industry's primary point of contact for pre- and post-deployment evaluations of their frontier AI models, and also publication of a framework to advance governance and risk management in national security. So that the National Security Memorandum assigned several responsibilities to the Department of Defense, but for the most part, executive language has really left many responsibilities to the Defense Department's discretion, and DoD has made significant strides in this space. For instance, by issuing DoD Directive 3000.09, which sets out some policies for governing semi-autonomous and autonomous weapon systems. Regulators and law enforcement bodies have also taken action of their own volition outside of the executive order. So we've seen the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice investigate anti-competitive practices and deceptive consumer practices. So while much activities happen in the executive branch, Congress has not been completely idle. Early in the 118th Congress, a bipartisan working group hosted several AI Insight forums, which brought in experts to talk about pressing policy issues that AI posed. And this culminated in a roadmap for AI policy in the Senate, which outlined several AI policy priorities for the next Congress. And this touched on topics ranging from explainability to copyright issues. Looking to the states, Owen, you mentioned SB 1047. This was a California bill that was ultimately vetoed by Governor Newsom, but it did really shape the debate in the United States around AI innovation, AI safety, and developer obligations. So to summarize, AI governance has taken a lot of forms in the United States, but a comprehensive federal AI law has proven elusive. Over the past year, the executive branch has really been the center of gravity, but this may not continue into the next administration. Looking forward, I'd expect new requirements placed on AI developers to originate from the states.
Great, thanks, Mina. So, long story short, a lot of activity, mostly decentralized effort. So, a fascinating kind of contrast with Europe, which Mia will tell us about now.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Owen. And thanks, Mina, for this really great summary, which is going to look very different because AI governance had a really big year in Europe this year too, but not because of the volume of what has been done, but because of the impact of course, adopting the AI Act, this landmark AI regulation. To sum it up very briefly, I'm happy to talk more about the law in the Q&A, but the regulation takes a risk-based approach. This means that it defines the obligations and the requirements for AI systems based on the level of risk that the AI system's use poses to health, safety, and fundamental rights of EU citizens. The first part of the regulation concerns so-called narrow or single-purpose AI systems and categorizes their use cases by level of risk. An increasing level of risk is then associated with increasingly restrictive obligations to the point of unacceptable use cases being completely banned from EU markets. The second part of the regulation then deals with general purpose AI systems that don't have a predetermined use case and therefore don't fit into any of the categories of the first part. Again, here, the AI Act takes a risk-based approach by requiring additional governance measures for models that could pose so-called systemic risk, which is determined both by the model's capabilities and by the degree of its integration into the EU economy. So now that the EU AI Act has been adopted and it's in force, one might think like, okay, they're done. They've done all the work on AI governance that there is to do, but that's really not true. So now that the rules of the road have been kind of defined, a lot of effort is going into their implementation, of course, because despite being very comprehensive, the AI Act is actually relatively vague at times on how to comply with its requirements. And this is where a lot of ongoing work since the summer has been trying to direct efforts to add specificity. And there are three strands of work that I think are worth mentioning because I expect them to be fairly influential in shaping how AI governance is going to play out in the EU in the coming years. The first is the drafting of the Code of Practice for General Purpose AI Systems, which is a multi-stakeholder process that is currently ongoing until the spring and hopes to define guidelines on how to implement the requirements for general purpose AI providers. The second is the creation of standards for trustworthy AI by European standard-making bodies, which are going to support the AI Act and operationalize its obligations. And the third is the secondary legislation that will be issued by the AI Office in the coming months and years. So before I kind of conclude and we hand it off to Cole, I want to highlight also one other major AI governance achievement coming out of Europe from this year, aside from the AI Act, which is that in May, the Council of Europe, which is not an EU institution, but another multilateral governance body, it adopted the Treaty on Artificial Intelligence, which at that point was the first ever international legally binding treaty on AI governance. It was negotiated by over 50 nations and has since been signed by 37, including all of the members of the EU and the United States. The treaty sets out relatively high-level provisions that aim to ensure the respect of human rights, the rule of law, and democratic norms in the use of AI systems, and covers in scope mostly AI used by the public sector. It's more ambiguous in how it affects the private sector, and that's actually something that the treaty has been criticized for quite heavily by civil society organizations, because it leaves a lot of leeway for signatories and how they implement the obligations and provisions to the private sector, which means that some signatories might not actually implement these provisions for the private sector at all. But the reason I want to highlight the Council of Europe's kind of accomplishment is because I think it's a really great example of a successful multilateral AI governance, while at the same time serving as a great example for how difficult it is to actually find common ground on AI governance, even for countries that are, somewhat similar and generally aligned on a lot of these foundational values like democratic norms. And I think next we're going to hear about AI governance from a country that is a lot less aligned with many of these nations, and that we're still going to have to coordinate and collaborate with.
Yeah, thank you, Mia. That's a great point. I mean, it highlights the challenges both of coordination and trying to approach governance and regulation kind of preemptively, which I think we can get into that discussion a little bit more in the Q&A. Yeah, finally, Cole, tell us a little bit about what's going on with China. And I think you were also planning to speak a little bit about how it's taking an approach to the global south as well.
Yeah, thanks, Owen. Yeah, so I'll focus on China's approach to AI governance. The first thing to know is that China's an extremely serious player when it comes to AI governance. It has one of the most developed AI governance regimes in the world. This may come as a surprise for those of us in Washington who think about China as a kind of chief competitor with the United States, but Beijing's long recognized AI as a really important priority, both to ensure China's kind of tech competitiveness, but also as a potential source of risks. That means that Beijing's is forced to navigate between promoting competitiveness in order to compete, but also ensuring social stability. AI as a technology is especially risky for a regime that's extremely focused on kind of maintaining social stability, ensuring kind of long-term kind of governance outcomes for the CCP. So the harms from AI, deepfakes, misinformation, and the like are unacceptable. So, I mean, but at the same time, you have to remember, kind of Beijing's really deemed AI as a critical technology for use in the defense sector, promote productivity gains, achieve Xi's kind of innovation-driven development strategy. And I just bring up this kind of chief tension because I think it underscores how China thinks about AI governance. So China was an early adopter of kind of any regulations around AI or algorithms. So from kind of 2019 to 2023, we saw China introduce several of the strongest AI governance regulations in the world at the time, requiring AI developers to comply with strict disclosure measures, really setting an extremely high bar for kind of AI developers and AI models to ensure truth and accuracy. And we know that's a very difficult thing to do as an AI developer, ensure that your model's producing outputs that are kind of quote unquote true. And we don't really know China's future approach, but we have seen in the past year indications that China is moving away from this very, very strict governance regime towards a little bit of a more permissive way of thinking about AI governance. So there's a draft AI law of the PRC that was published in March of this year. It still includes a lot of these regulatory measures that we've seen in previous iterations, but it's much more focused on promoting innovation. You still have very strict compliance requirements for AI developers. The Cyberspace Administration of China runs an algorithmic registry where if you're an AI developer, you have to submit a host of different data about your AI models. So basically, if you're an AI developer in China, you have to be extremely in tune with Chinese regulators. You need a lot of overhead to kind of adhere to those regulations. But this is a fast-moving space, and we should see a lot more coalescing around how China will think about governing AI going in the kind of going into next year and into years in the future. I would characterize China's approach to AI governance as extremely iterative and very state-driven, right? So they the state thinks about how to react to new developments that are happening based on both kind of external pressures and internal domestic pressures. And they continue to iterate at a very kind of fast speed that AI developers need to react to. So I think strengths, the Chinese government has a tremendous head start in understanding how to do AI governance. The regulatory regime has been established and it's been in place for a number of years already. But a weakness, if you're an AI developer in China, you have to invest tremendous resources to be able to comply with a difficult regulatory regime. You have to be able to understand how to navigate a complex and shifting AI governance landscape. And so I just would flag that for people for something to think about in terms of how you think about China's approach to AI governance. And then lastly, just as you mentioned, Owen, one of the most important developments from this year was China's increased focus on kind of its international engagement as it relates to AI governance. So China's coalesced around this global AI governance initiative. It's established a lot of multilateral mechanisms around developing norms and standards around AI and AI governance in BRICS, in the Belt and Road Initiative, Digital Silk Road, and they've remained involved in the United Nations efforts on AI and the AI safety summits. They signed the Bletchley Declaration. So I would expect them to remain extremely engaged in these international engagements to try to shape the development of norms and standards around AI governance, especially as it relates to kind of the Global South, where they've already put in a lot of that legwork to think about kind of influencing those conversations.
Great, thanks, Cole. I think after those first initial remarks from all of you, we have a good sense of kind of the different aspects of each ecosystem, right? And in some senses, they are very distinct. But I was wondering if any of you wanted to weigh in on where you see potential areas of overlap or some similarities in governance approaches, which might actually contribute to future collaboration on AI governance efforts, or like Cole was mentioning at the end there, international collaboration. Are there any areas that you think are particularly kind of fertile for cooperation?
I'm happy to jump in here real quick. I think the easiest avenue of collaboration is where economic incentives are driving the three nations, because there you'll have equally incentivized actors that aim to collaborate for economic gain. So having said that, I think that area would be standards, international harmonized standards that all three markets want to adopt in order to facilitate trade, in particular in kind of sectors like machinery, medical devices, and vehicles. These are all sectors that will be covered by the obligations under the AI Act, and where kind of these harmonized standards that are being developed by standard making bodies right now will play a very central role in how these requirements of the act are actually going to be operationalized. So I do expect to see a lot of collaboration and coordination between the US and China and the EU in order to kind of find good compromise on what these standards will actually look like to facilitate trade and economic kind of gain for all of these markets.
Yeah, I'll emphasize Mia's comments on standard setting. I think standards around testing and evaluation of AI systems is an especially ripe area for collaboration. The NIST AI Safety Institute has made a lot of headway in this area, and as Mia mentioned, the EU AI office is looking to implement the AI Act, and in order to do that, standards around risk management and evaluations need to be created. Senior Chinese government officials have also expressed concerns around AI safety, and so I think everyone really has a vested interest in ensuring that AI systems work as intended.
Yeah, I would just add, I actually think this is a really kind of fertile ground for collaboration in a period where collaboration, especially between the United States and China, is is limited. I think there's tremendous overlap in kind of the stuff that you hear from the Chinese government and the stuff you hear from the US government and definitely the EU around just prioritization of some of kind of understanding these basic principles for establishing AI governance measures. You've seen a ton of action already in multilateral fora, and I think that will continue. So especially from the United States, remaining engaged in those conversations is tremendously important because it can get influenced one way if you have one player not at the table.
No, that's a good point. And I think another important player at the table in this conversation is obviously the private sector. So many of the developments that are happening are originating out of the private sector, whereas, game-changing innovations of the past typically may have had more of a government hand from the offset. This is obviously like quite a different scenario, particularly with some of these foundational models. If we could just kind of go down the line in terms of US, EU, China, what do you see as the roles of the private sector in helping to either develop or contribute or just be regulated by governance efforts?
Yeah, I can start us off here. So I'll start by stating the obvious. A lot of the big AI companies call the United States home and reside in the United States. We've seen a concentration of market power up and down the AI stack. And this has led to just a few chip makers, cloud service providers, AI model developers to emerge as key players in this space. And that affords them great lobbying power, the ability to shape legislation. And they also have the ability to shape norms around the technology. There are small and medium-sized enterprises in the US and abroad that really build their whose business model relies on this technology.
Mia, do you want to tell us a bit about the private sector relationship with Europe, which I
You
imagine is
mean,
quite different?
I do think it's quite different. I mean, aside from being regulated though, so obviously the regulation is written and private sector companies are subject to this regulation. But especially for like the next couple of years, I do think that private sector players have a chance to influence the implementation of the AI Act. And I think two avenues that I already mentioned are worth highlighting here. First of all, the drafting of the code of practice, which is happening right now, which is purposely a multi-stakeholder approach that includes academia and civil society, but also industry players in order to write and operationalize kind of the guidelines of the regulation that in a way that will make it feasible and demonstrable to show compliance with the requirements. And I think industry players obviously have an incentive to participate in that process. Big tech players, big tech players are part of these working groups, and I think they come in with their own needs and goals for how they want to influence that process, certainly by trying to make it a little less restrictive and less demanding. But also, for instance, we would expect, for instance, small companies, medium-sized companies from Europe to try and get carve-outs for these SMEs and startups in order to be able to compete with these bigger tech companies. And the second process that I want to highlight as like an opportunity for influencing regulations still is through the standards making bodies. Industry is very well represented in these bodies and usually have a significant say in like what is feasible and what isn't, and also have kind of the practical knowledge of how to actually do a lot of these, how they implement a lot of these requirements in practice. And standards play a very significant role in the AI Act, right? Because kind of adherence to these standards, which are currently under development, will presume compliance with the obligations under the AI Act. So who and how these standards are going to define are going to really materially shape what governance will look like in practice in the EU in the future.
And just a quick follow-up on that. I mentioned earlier that the Draghi report on economic competitiveness and technology was released in September of this year. It was frankly like a pretty damning indictment of the tech ecosystem in Europe. Do you see any possibility that that shapes the approach to AI governance in the future, other than trying to develop the workforce or decomplicate things a bit?
Well, I do hope that people have taken this report to heart. I think it was both in a way fairly accurate and in a way very damning. I think there are a few kind of aspects that are worth highlighting. So first, the skills shortage, which is a major obstacle to implementing the AI Act and oversight, and also to innovation in Europe, is not a domain where the Commission has a lot of influence, actually. So education is a member state, is under the authority of member states. So while there is an European kind of skills strategy, there isn't a lot of kind of European money going into like education strategies at the member state level. On the other side, we do have a new commission coming in that can define kind of new priorities. And I think it's worth looking a little bit at what the new commissioner for tech sovereignty, security, and democracy, her name is Henna Verkunen, has kind of stated that her plans, about her plans on how to kind of govern technology in the future. So we're just talking about the digital sides of the Draghi report, of course. And she's highlighted priority areas that I think are pretty much aligned with what the Draghi report has highlighted. She wants to address the productivity gap and the innovation gap by supporting AI development in the EU, by investments in cloud infrastructure, among other things. She also wants to invest in the diffusion of AI technology in the economy to also help drive productivity and growth. But she's also recognized, and that's something fairly new, so on the aspect of kind of national security and kind of, I guess, strategic autonomy of the EU, which has become kind of this call phrase of the von der Leyen Commission. She has emphasized the need for greater investments in disruptive technologies on the battlefield. So there's likely going to be some money going into innovation, similar to kind of a DARPA structure, I'm guessing, in the US, that's really focusing on innovation of disruptive technologies for military and defense purposes to strengthen like Europe's security. So these are some priorities that she's highlighted that I expect to see some movement on, that hopefully also address, and hopefully will succeed in addressing some of these issues that Draghi has outlined and found.
That's really fascinating. Yeah. I mean, Cole, can you tell us a little bit about the nuances of the PRC relationship
Yeah.
between the CCP and the private sector?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's kind of two ways to divide it. One is what's happening within China, and I think on that side, the private sector works in close collaboration with the state sector, and they have meetings and kind of drive AI governance that way. But honestly, the state sector is really the prime kind of player in AI governance in China. We've seen less of a role for the private sector, at least out in the open, in terms of shaping China's kind of AI governance regime, and on a big role for academia in China in terms of kind of shaping approaches to AI governance. Where I think kind of China's private sector, commercial sector, I'll say commercial sector, not private sector, the role that where I think the kind of Chinese companies play a big role in shaping international AI regulation is thinking about companies that are operating abroad. So we already saw this in kind of the standard settings conversations in the transition from 4G to 5G. You've seen Huawei and ZTE have played an enormous role in kind of shaping standards around ICT technologies. And I think it's still a nascent technology, and we don't know exactly how it'll shape out to be with AI. I think you could see a similar phenomenon happening, right? Where because China already has a lot of that infrastructure set in place, the data centers have been built by Huawei all over the world. You have already an infrastructure where kind of Chinese AI developers and AI providers can shape how norms and standards around how AI is used around the world. And I think there's tremendous opportunity for kind of those players to really shape how AI is used, right? And that can then have impacts on kind of global AI governance norms.
Great, thanks, Cole. And I'd just like to remind everyone, if you have a question, please drop it in the chat, and we are collecting them, and we'll start to go through a few of those in a moment. I just wanted to kind of conclude our questions with one big picture for each of you. Like, looking into the future, what do you think are some of the developments in each of your regions that we should keep an eye out for? What are kind of the markers for 2025 and beyond that you're looking at in terms of AI governance, whether that's the possibility of actual legislation or more of a decentralized approach, et cetera? Mina, why don't you kind of kick us off with that?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. I think looking forward, we can expect to see more state activity in this space. We may see more state laws focused on combating deepfakes around election time, protecting people's likeness online, and preventing the distribution of things like non-consensual intimate imagery and CSAM. We may also see more corporate self-governance, where essentially the AI industry is policing itself. I think in the next administration, we may see a greater focus on or a continued focus on supply chain resilience and competition. I think, though, regardless of what the administration's policy priorities are, whether it's supply chain resilience, whether it's competing on the world stage, or supporting innovation domestically, I think having an understanding of the capabilities and limitations of AI systems is critical. So I'd encourage policymakers to really, think about continue advancing AI evaluation science and standards for AI safety.
Mia or Cole, do you want to jump in on that question?
I want to echo what Mina said in terms of the priorities for kind of AI safety developments in the future. I think I've already pointed to a lot of the developments in the EU. We have a new incoming commission that's going to shape new priorities. We have the codes of practice that are going to be finalized and hopefully determine a specific set of rules for the general purpose AI providers. I think one thing I haven't highlighted yet is that a lot of the implementation work is going to be distributed between the AI office and the national market surveillance authorities between the EU. And I think especially at the beginning of the enforcement action, we're going to see a lot of additional coordination work happening in order to prevent kind of regulatory fragmentation and different interpretations of the law. So I do expect some to be some hiccups as everybody gets set up. I think that's going to be definitely a challenge for the upcoming year in the EU.
Yeah, just on my end to jump in. So broadening out from just China, I think one of the most interesting developments to look out for in the coming year is what do we see with the development of this concept of sovereign AI in the Asia Pacific? So sovereign AI, it's pretty nascent still, but more and more countries are thinking, well, I have to hop on the kind of AI hype train here. We have to develop our own AI models with our own country's conditions kind of accounted for, right? So you've already seen tremendous investment in AI strategies in Korea, Singapore, obviously China and India. Will you see that across the Asia Pacific? Is this something where we're going to have a more fragmented system where every country thinks they need to build its own kind of national AI capabilities? Will that continue? What does that look like? We don't really know. If every country wants to develop its own kind of models from the ground up, that takes kind of tremendous investments. And AI will create winners and losers. So not everyone is going to be able to participate in kind of being on the cutting edge of AI. So how do countries react to that and then adapt so they can kind of push their own advantages and not over investing in a sector where they're not competitive?
Yeah, thanks, Cole. I think this question is probably geared more towards Mina and Mia, but one of the questions highlighted the challenges of developing and implementing standards while test and evaluation systems for AI are still semi-nascent or could be considered underdeveloped in some ways. So I was wondering if either or both of you could speak a little bit about the progress that we would hope to see in testing and evaluation and how that can contribute to good AI governance in the future.
Sure, I can start us off. So the US AI Safety Institute has made a lot of headway in conducting AI safety research, advancing measurement science, and promulgating risk management standards for AI. I'd expect, this growing network of AI safety institutes to continue that trajectory. I think these summits that have been regularly happening are a good opportunity for different countries to come together and really sort of inject their own views into the AI governance discussion via topics on AI testing and evaluation or something else. I think we'll continue to see these summits as a forum to identify kind of emerging areas of consensus.
I'm just heavily nodding here because I very much agree with what Mina said. I think the excuse me, the AI Safety Institutes are going to play a really central role here in trying to align techniques and with measurements techniques and assessment techniques with with the views and values and governance strategies of the specific countries. I do think the network has this amazing benefit that it will allow researchers to collaborate, to share their insights, and therefore just kind of diffuse this knowledge and these techniques and these best practices more quickly across the world, especially since not every AI Safety Institute is going to have the same role or same capabilities in innovating and researching this type of stuff. I think certainly the US and also the UK AI Safety Institutes have shown that they have the capacity to develop really best practices and state-of-the-art measures for AI governance and testing evaluation. I'm thinking of the NIST AI risk management framework, for instance, whereas I think the AI office in the EU, for instance, is certainly also well equipped with to do some safety evaluations and testing, but their main focus is going to be on implementation and enforcement of the AI Act. So there's just going to be trade-offs, and different AI safety institutes will share a bigger burden or share higher influence on how these testing and safety evaluation practices will look like in practice.
Thanks for that. Cole, I think we've had a conversation. It's kind of emerged over the course of our conversation about AI governance in the context of geopolitical competition. I'm wondering from your research what you've seen about China's kind of willingness to collaborate with other countries on AI innovation and governance efforts. You've mentioned it a little bit, but I'm wondering if you could expand on how you think there are challenges and opportunities stemming from the kind of geopolitical competition, especially that we might expect to see in the coming year or so.
Yeah, definitely. So I think China is going to remain engaged, right? I think China has expressed and kind of we've seen that prioritization. They came to the AI Safety Summit. They're really involved in these kind of multilateral fora. I think the question is, do the partners in those kind of those kind of cross-country collaborations, do they see value in those collaborations, right? So I think we've seen a deep skepticism here in the United States about collaborations with China. I think U.S. policymakers are going to need to see some progress in terms of making concessions and seeing those concessions actually followed, right, on the behalf of the Chinese. I think there's huge opportunity to coalesce around kind of shared standards and norms at a more basic level. So some of the stuff that me and Mina have already talked about kind of testing and evaluation and kind of these more basic norms that I think we've seen already. China and the United States and the EU and basically most countries around the world have already said we prioritize these and we want to see kind of these basic standards around safety and controllability and explainability. So I think there is huge opportunity there. And I think it would be a mistake on the behalf of kind of the United States and the EU to shut out China from these dialogues because there's a lot where we share, and the differences, we might not be able to come to agreement on those differences, especially around like China's global AI governance initiative. A lot of it is about kind of mutual respect for kind of internal conditions, and that runs counter to some of the democratic norms that I think is really important in the United States and in the EU. That doesn't mean that there's not real work that can be done.
Thanks. And I think it's a related follow-up question that I'm seeing in the chat, but as we kind of consider the role that different values in different countries play, you mentioned sovereign AI before. Do you view that as an obstacle or an opportunity to kind of work on collective AI governance issues across countries? Is that something that facilitate and countries could bring their best practices to the table, or is that something that an individualized approach might set up barriers and reticence to share? What are your thoughts on that, Cole?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I don't think that's a question we have an answer to yet, right? I think as countries start to think about AI more carefully, especially countries that are not at the cutting edge of being really, really competitive, I think you've seen a lot of reticence to establish kind of AI governance regulations that might infringe on competitiveness. So in South Korea, there's legislation that's been on the books for more than a year now that's supposed to introduce kind of AI governance, just progress, right? And because of those competitiveness concerns, I think you haven't seen very much action. The same is true. Japan and Singapore and India are all very focused on competitiveness. And so I think to Mia's earlier point, ensuring that the kind of international governance measures and conversations don't run counter to the economic interests of these countries, I think that's how you ensure progress is made rather than kind of fragmentation and a breakdown in those conversations.
No, great point. So pivoting to, I think, more of the kind of democratic side of the conversation for a minute, we've talked about the role of the public sector. We've talked about the role of the private sector. We haven't spoken as much about the role that civil society plays when it comes to AI governance issues, either in terms of thinking about the ethical considerations that we want to have when it comes to AI or the societal implications and what we view as really important. I'm wondering, Mina and Mia, if you could give us an idea of the role that you think civil society plays in the US and Europe, respectively, when it comes to the AI governance conversation.
Did you want to start this one, Mia?
I'm happy to. So I think that's actually a really good question because there isn't really a predefined role for civil society to kind of go in and shape governance discussions, right? Not at least at the regulatory level. So of course, civil society organizations are equally represented in kind of the multi-stakeholder approach for the code of practice drafting that I already mentioned earlier. They're having usually a much harder time getting involved in standards, which is the second avenue for the private sector organizations usually kind of get involved in AI governance. Private civil society organizations are not typically represented there to the same degree because technical standards didn't used to evolve so much around human rights questions, right? These used to be more deterministic safety issues with governed around like physical laws, whereas AI systems now, the question is about like what does it mean to be fair? How can we make sure it's explainable? And these are questions where civil society organizations should be able to weigh in, but they don't have the resources or kind of the muscle memory of getting involved in these discussions as much as private sector industry has. I do think that civil society in the EU is going to play a significant role as a watchdog a little bit, trying to point to shortcomings of the regulation, where there are loopholes, identifying kind of where the EU Commission, who is actually able to adopt the AI Act in the future, for instance, by expanding the list of high-risk use cases. I think so civil society, I think, plays an important role in kind of highlighting where improvements and adaptations need to be made. But of course, this is a really, really tricky role to have because it's just so expansive, right? It's like you keep monitoring everything. Please keep monitoring a society and stand up for everything that goes wrong. But I think that they will their role in that is going to be extremely, extremely valuable and important.
I agree that civil society's role is extremely valuable and important. So civil society has had an opportunity to unite and collaborate with other stakeholders when it comes to AI safety and risk management in the US through the AI Safety Consortium that was stood up in the spring. I think civil society in the US is acutely concerned with the risks and harms from AI, and I've seen a greater focus on kind of pre-deployment interventions rather than pushing for kind of primarily interventions that take place after systems are deployed and after harms occur. And so I think this is also a good opportunity to bring up a project that I've been working on with several CSET colleagues, Jessica G. and Vikram Venkatram, also a former CSET colleague, Norla Wong. We've actually been analyzing several different US AI governance proposals, and one of them is from a civil society organization. And we're focused on identifying common assumptions or common prerequisites across those proposals. And we think it's important for policymakers to think about those prerequisites, especially given kind of the rapid pace of technology and the need to balance many and sometimes competing interests of stakeholders. And so thinking about kind of what are common enablers of a lot of different proposals can help policymakers take action and preserve some decision-making flexibility down the road without kind of locking themselves into one specific AI governance vision. So keep your eyes out for that.
Yes, and I think our moderator has already shared some of the links in the sidebar, but you can find all of these reports on our website, including soon the ones that are due to come out. I want to turn quickly to the question of the Global South. So I think the United Nations and some of the work it's done on AI governance called for involving the Global South in efforts. There's kind of a fundamental challenge between the nations that are producing the cutting edge AI models that we've mostly been talking about in this conversation and what the role for the Global South should be. I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts on that, or if you have more general thoughts about how your countries that you focused on here today have kind of focused on engaging more broadly with a diverse set of actors in the international community. Cole, why don't we start it off with you?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, the role that the kind of emerging market economies in the global south will play in kind of shaping how AI is used is super important. The kind of productivity gains and kind of exciting potential of AI is not restricted to the three countries that or three areas that we've been talking about today. I think one area that I'm very excited about is kind of increased focus on these smaller models that are kind of deployable, kind of using kind of smaller compute intensive resources. Um, this is an area not to bring it back to China and the United States again, but this is an area where I really see China's intense focus on kind of engagement with the global South as a big advantage because they will put in a ton of resources and it might not be profitable and it might not be profitable for years to come, but they will put in the kind of resources needed to build out capacity and capabilities that can be suited to local conditions, right? And so I think that's one thing for kind of policymakers in the US and in the EU to really think about is how the the stuff that China says vis-a-vis the global South is not just lip service, right? This is a real focus that they've prioritized now for over a decade, and that will continue. Uh, so I just would say I just would kind of implore policymakers to think about that issue a little bit more than I think we are. We're really focused on frontier AI and not as focused on kind of the use of AI for really impactful, amazing purposes all over the world, not just in these kind of three countries we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a really good and important reminder that we should not kind of limit our scope in the context of geopolitical competition that we often find ourselves focusing on. Mina or Mia, did either of you want to jump in on that?
I'll jump in here. I know I already mentioned these AI Safety Institute summits and convenings, but it's been really interesting to see how the focus of these summits have slightly shifted over time. So the UK AI Safety Summit was really focused on kind of uniting people around safety for frontier AI systems and getting companies to commit to do some voluntary testing of their systems. At the Seoul Summit, we saw the focus on AI safety, but we also saw a focus on innovation and inclusivity in a lot of the discussion that was happening. And around that time, a lot of other countries announced their own establishment of safety institutes, including in France, Canada, Singapore, and elsewhere. And looking to the next summit in France, it's expected that the host there will focus on openness of AI and supporting the open source AI ecosystem. And so I think these are opportunities for countries to sort of get more on equal footing with with like the United States and the UK and some other countries, and really put their perspectives out there on what the future of AI governance should look like.
I will just jump in here with some final thoughts. So I think both what Cole and Mina said has been really valuable as like in terms of opportunity, but also need to engage the global South and other nations aside from kind of this triangle of geopolitics that we like to talk about. I do think that the EU was kind of hoping to have this multilateral international global effect with its regulation by writing kind of this first very comprehensive framework that focuses on human rights protection. They were hoping certainly to have the Brussels effect, essentially exporting it as like a global standard. Now I've lost my train of thought, but I think one of the difficulties that they are facing now is that because the AI Act is so vague, the implementation is fairly strenuous, and it's undermining some of the original goal of the regulation, which was to create regulatory certainty and like spur this socially beneficial innovation in the tech space that will be aligned with the requirements of the act. And at the same time, a lot of other countries who were potentially considering using the AI Act as a template for their own regulatory strategy are now in this process of observing every obstacle that is hampering the actual kind of launch of the European kind of strategy on AI. And I think that is certainly a weakness, and that the EU would hopefully will soon be able to kind of even out with better guidance.
I think that ties kind of nicely into the last question, because I know we're over time here. But, by way of concluding, and I think we'll go Cole, Mina, Mia for this. What are you either optimistic or pessimistic about when it comes to AI governance in 2025? Cole, you're the first to have to tackle this one, so sorry for that.
Yeah. I'm really optimistic about the future of some of these pretty nascent multilateral fora, thinking about how to really start to agree on a set of common standards and norms, which we've seen a little bit of in the past year or year and a half. But I think 2025 is a really big year to start to implement some serious, not just words on paper, but start to make real progress on this. AI, still an incredibly new technology, but it's no longer a newborn, right? We have some understanding of it. I'm really heartened by all of the government response across the world, recognizing AI for kind of this really impactful technology that I think we all agree that it is. And so I think there's a lot of cause for optimism around that.
The paper proliferation can definitely be real. I think that's a good point, Cole. Mina, over to you.
Yeah, so I can touch a little bit on, I think, both the pessimistic side of things and also the optimistic side of things. The incoming administration has criticized Biden's AI executive order as government overreach, and certainly it would be kind of politically symbolic to undo Biden's executive order. But I also think it's important to note that Biden's executive order really builds on the foundations that of the two executive orders under Trump. Both of those, all of those orders focus on enhancing AI research and development, strengthening the AI workforce, contributing to shared data and compute resources, and developing AI standards. And so, I wouldn't yet jump to conclusions about, what will or will not be dismantled in the next administration. I think Biden's executive order did galvanize a lot of agency action. Agencies have, for example, appointed chief AI officers, and some have established governance boards to coordinate the use of AI within agencies. There were several kind of deliverables and timelines that were set out in the executive order. And so plenty of action has already been taken on making sure to ensure that the US can harness AI for good.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and it's probably worth noting to some extent that there were actually what some might consider surprising similarities in some of the priorities between executive orders across the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, as well as signing on to some of international agreements, the G7 and OECD, as Cole mentioned. So I think it's a little bit soon to try to preemptively judge the space. Mia, take us home.
Okay, final words. That's a big responsibility. I think so. In terms of pessimism, I do want to kind of point out that from the EU perspective, the incoming administration is not necessarily maybe the one that everybody has hoped for. Speaking obviously, this is obviously my personal view, but I do expect US-EU relationships to worsen over the coming year. And I think with this, the EU is losing a really important multilateral partner to coordinate AI governance issues with. I'm thinking, for instance, to bring up the Council of Europe Treaty on AI again, the EU and the US were really kind of the drivers behind getting this overboard, negotiating with the like over 50 different parties, and getting over 30 of them to actually sign the treaty. And I think the EU is now losing, like I said, is losing an important partner for their multilateral outreach that is actually going to help them advocate for kind of a human rights, democratically centered AI governance strategy. At the same time, it's also not bad news for the EU because it lost a competitor in defining kind of what AI governance should look like, because the EU and the US obviously weren't completely aligned on how to do things. And this is an opportunity for the EU to kind of reach out and really promote their own vision for how to govern AI, also including oversight of the private sector in a way that they probably weren't able to do so before. And I think if they want to take the mantle and they shoulder this responsibility, this is really a chance for them to promote their view.
So an optimistic note for the EU there.
Yeah.
Well, great. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their thoughts today. They were really insightful. As always, we'll continue to track these issues in our own work at CSET, both in briefs and reports. And I'd like to thank all of you for attending our webinar today. Look forward to our next one in December. Thanks all.
Thank you so much.